Hello and welcome to the Demi Taste podcast, where we do a little bit of tasting and a lot of talking. Today, our guests are Anna Mantheakis, I hope I'm saying that correctly, and
You are.
Jonathan Harris of Westward. Jonathan Harris is the head of education, and Anna is a distiller and head of technical development, or as I like to think of her, the data person, with emphasis on the. They are both extremely knowledgeable about Westward and the various goings on at the distillery. And I am beyond thrilled to finally have them on the podcast. We've met a few times in person and never managed to get anything on record. So this is our chance to get all of the things on record. And as I'm told, they have been given pretty much no filter today, which is super awesome. John and Anna, would you please introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about what you do?
You want to start?
I'll start. Hi. I am Jonathan Harris. I'm head of education and collaborations for Westward Whiskey. I started in the industry probably about 10 years ago as an assistant winemaker, went the coffee roasting route after that, then distilling. And then I realized I like people more than I like machines. So I came up front for Westward about 4 years ago or so.
And I'm Anna. I was a winemaker before I became a distiller. I started with my boots on the ground at Westward, working in the distillery, cutting down single barrels and making cuts. And then I migrated the direction of my heart, which was into the laboratory because I have a scientific background. And I take on technical development projects, recipe development, as well as being a member of the blending team.
And the safety team.
And the safety team. I am
an important role.
I'm safety coordinator in production. So I am the person who will approach someone and say, you need to be wearing your safety glasses.
Yeah. You know, I'm just going to jump right in on that point. So of all the distilleries that I visited so far, Westward seems to have the most well-designed through line through the distillery. Like the tour goes through the actual facility, goes past all of the equipment. There's plenty of space. It's super well organized. I can't imagine a better space for a safety response in the event of something like a still implodes or something like that.
Yeah, we haven't had.
Luckily, we haven't had to approach
yet.
Yes.
When there was a tour on the premises, we recently had an impromptu drill. Though somebody was doing work on the fire suppression system, and they accidentally set off the fire alarm. And it was great practice for everybody. It was really fun, not scary at all. When the fire alarm suddenly went off.
I remember our team hitting the chemical alarm accidentally as well.
Oh yeah, we have one of those. Bumped into the chemical alarm.
But no, I mean, you bring up a really good point, especially for Portland. I find that the way that our system is set up, while we have already outgrown a lot of it, and we are rapidly growing, to this day. This is the second location we've ever distilled at. So everything is centralized here. Obviously, we are going grain to glass in the same building. I know you're a big fan of American single malt. And that's kind of a thing that we helped push forward. And so we do everything in-house. There's a lot of distilleries in Portland, but most of them are quite small. And so our first place that we distilled was very similar. So when we moved in here, we knew kind of the linear route we wanted to go and how to grow it. So it automatically lends to a good tour. It's a nice talking point to be like, yeah, to be an American single malt, we actually need to make all of our own juice, and that makes the tour just that much more interesting.
Yeah, on the note of the tour, I asked you if you would give us the short version of the tour, but let me first just sort of finish with my plug for you should, if you're ever in Portland, audience, you should go on this tour. You should go to this distillery, visit the tasting room. It's super bright and spacious and has great views of the stills. They don't have that many or any barrels on premise. But you can see sometimes the totes that they have in there where they're storing something that's in process of going somewhere. I think you do put the liquid into the barrels at the distillery and then move them off premise. Is that correct?
Yes.
We do. And if a tour is there on the right day, they'll see barrel prep. So they'll see our distillers hammering on the barrels, pressure testing them, and filling them in the distillery.
Awesome. The last time, so I've been on the tour twice now. The last time I was there on the tour, I was there with the two of you, and we sort of just, went off to the side and had a tangent for a while. And it was great that we were able to do that and we weren't in anybody's way, right? Distillation operations were still happening. We got to sit on the side and listen to making stuff. This is all just saying that, like, I've never felt safer in essentially an industrial plant, right? Like that's what alcohol production is in a sense, right?
We have
That's wonderful.
Anna to thank for that. I'm sure that's music to Anna's ears.
That is music to my ears. I want people to know that they are in good hands when they come into our facility, that it is a safe place to work and to be.
And not to go overly nerdy about coding and things like that, but when we were the biggest distillery in Portland, when we were doing all of that, and so our coding is very intense in a very good way, so that we have a lot of safety things put in place.
Great. So now that I've editorialized about the tour for a while, let's actually go through like what's sort of the technical specs that you would share with the public on a typical tour, just for the sake of our audience who may not be as familiar with you.
Right. I mean, the way I've always broken it down and kind of have a space to talk about it on each point in the tour is also very tied to what we'll talk about later, which is the club. Whiskey has always adapted to where it's being made. When we started making American single malt, it wasn't for the idea of like, oh, we should just make this new category. We wanted to make a whiskey that was the adaptation of what a whiskey is made in the Pacific Northwest. The only reason peated is involved in Islay whiskey is because there wasn't enough lumber, so they used petrified moss. The only reason we moved away from single malt when Europeans came to America is there wasn't enough barley on the East Coast. So they either had to not drink or make do, and like good Americans, they made do. And that adaptation was corn, of course. Well, we wanted to be kind of a further adaptation of when you get out here to the West Coast, barley is super plentiful again. And that's kind of the core of why we approach the idea of American single malt. So the very first thing I always talk about is a little bit of that story. So we started as a company about 20 years ago now. So we are celebrating our 20 years this year, which is pretty old as far as artisanal distilling goes. It was just us and a handful of other distilleries in America. And now, there's definitely a few thousand. And then I talk about our malt area. So we are using all local malted barley. So Pacific Northwest, when we say local at this point, because we're going through about, I think at this point, 1.5 million pounds of barley a year, roughly. But we are using now what's called Odyssey malt, which Anna can get into some talk about it a little later. This is kind of a really new thing for us. It's really exciting. So I'll put a little pin in that conversation. And then I usually spend a decent amount of my tour talking about our brew side of things, because that is where Westward, even apart from most American single malt distilleries, have a completely different approach, in that Westward is founded by a bunch of brewers. And if we are an adaptation of what a whiskey looks like in Oregon specifically, we're going to tap into kind of the culture around that. I find it a little bit crazy that the approach was, when you're making a high-end meal, you're not using really trash ingredients to get there. So it should matter what we're using at the front end of the process. And a lot of people approach whiskey, even the most high-end whiskeys are using, distiller's yeast, dry yeast, turbo yeast, to be very efficient. And that's what whiskey was aiming to be for a very long time. And the thought process was, we're going to get 80% of our flavor from that barrel. So it doesn't matter as much. Whereas Westward is thinking more balanced, thinking more 50-50. We want a lot of that flavor coming from our wash, coming from our new make. So we use a brewer's yeast, a very high ester Chico strain yeast, just so that we can develop more of those kind of like citrusy and floral tones. And that tends to be what I see missing in a lot of American whiskey. They have super stellar vanilla, caramels, woods. What I don't see as much is that kind of stone fruit, floral, which isn't to say, I want to say this right up front, which isn't to say our approach is right and other approaches are wrong. It's just a different approach. But proof is in the pudding. We've seen when we are using different strains of yeast, which in our club, we will switch out these different prospects. So like we'll switch out what malt we're using, we'll switch out what yeast we're using, we'll switch out barrel. And just switching that yeast fundamentally changes our taste profile. And then taking it over to the distilling side of things, because we've spent so long on our brew side of things, we actually take a kind of really cool rustic approach to our distillation, in that we have a really low reflux custom still, which basically allows for, distilling is deceptively simple. You're heating up a liquid till when you're turning those alcohol into vapors, you force those vapors back down into a liquid. What copper is doing in a copper pot still is a couple of things, but it's also adding reflux, in that when those vapors are rising, they grab on, fall back down, and redistill. So because we aren't looking to clean up the wash and the spirit that we've made at this point, we want a lot more of that kind of oily texture, a lot more of that funk coming through. Not trying to hide anything. So that's kind of, in my mind, what gives Westward a lot of its richness, which Westward is a very rich whiskey. And some of that is also then tied to our barreling, which that is how we are kind of tapping into the American flavor profile of whiskey as well. And that we are aging like a bourbon. So New American white oak, lightly charred all the way through.
Nice. Let's take a quick break from the tour and actually get some whiskey in our glasses. So
yes.
Phil is new to Westward. I believe he just got his bottle of the Westward Stout cask
Tuesday.
Tuesday, yeah.
Hey,
So
congratulations. All right.
I don't have the Stout cask, but what I have is I have the Pinot cask from.
Oh my gosh, we have the full spread, guys.
We have the sets. Yeah.
Yeah, nice.
We have an original right here.
Nice. So I guess between all of us, do you have a cask strength there too, or
no cask? But we do have a special club bottle with us.
We have our sneak preview.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you happen to have on hand any samples of the recent club releases?
I do.
I might want to get into those later, just in the sense that like I actually have something on hand that I can speak to, since your new club release isn't available yet. But I have the last couple handy.
Cool.
So we'll get into that later. But anyway, let's get into sort of the core lineup. So this one was actually Alexandra sent me this as a sample a couple of years ago. It quickly became my comfort whiskey. At the end of 2022, I got COVID and lost my palate for about 10 days. Couldn't taste anything.
I would be crying.
In the time, I was terrified because I've got 200 bottles of whiskey that would be garbage essentially, right? I'd have to give them away if I couldn't get my palate back. I was stressing out about that. I'm sure that anybody who's a whiskey reviewer who's lost their palate can relate. So when my palate came back, when I was able to taste things again, it started with cinnamon was the first thing that I could taste. And then one of my favorite whiskeys was the first thing that I could taste after that. But I couldn't name tasting notes anymore, which was my second terrifying anxiety. Like my brain had to get rewired for tasting notes once my palate came back. And I somehow settled on this bottle as my comfort whiskey because it has enough complexity and it has a really nice fruitiness and that richness to it. That just like it ticked all of the boxes of like, I can relax with this. I don't have to think about it, but I can if I want to. It's got enough complexity that I can dig into if I want it, but it's otherwise just delicious, right? I don't have to think about it to enjoy it. And that really worked for me. So about 2 or 3 months after I got my palate back, this was my daily drinker. And it was the first time in my life that I had a true daily drinker. This was almost the only thing I was drinking. So, this bottle here has a special place in my heart.
That's beautiful.
I love that. That is very beautiful.
I mean, it brought you back from an experience that is like, just like, a blender's worst nightmare.
I was going to say, I'm pretty sure everyone on this call is like,
yeah. So I'm
short of breath.
So
on that
happy.
idea.
Yeah. I was hanging on your every word, Doug. I just like, oh God, sounds so bad.
It's a pretty good story. But yeah, I was like, if I never get my ability to name tasting notes back, at least I have whiskey like this that I can enjoy,
Now
the way that quote unquote normal people enjoy whiskey, where
just drink it and have a good time. And to give so I feel like we keep throwing around the idea of we're saying stout and Pinot, and just to give listeners kind of a context for that, basically everything is going to be based on our blue label, which is our original, and then we do two main finishes, which are our stout finished whiskey and our Pinot Noir finished whiskey, which we do with local places, and then our cask strength, which is the only one that is not represented on video right now.
And then additionally, haven't we added the rum cask recently to the lineup in the tasting room?
Rum cask is part of our Oregon lineup, which is a 100
Okay.
proof rum cask finish.
Just the Oregon lineup. All right,
I think it's slowly making its way into some markets.
cool.
It's 100 proof?
It is 100 proof, yes. Westward is traditionally at 90 proof for bottle strength and 125 for our cask. But we're not trying to marry ourselves just to one proof. If something tastes better at a different proof, might as well drink it at that.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice. I have the club release of the rum cask, the original club release from 2022, I think.
I think that is 2022.
This was the bottle that I joined the club for, actually.
Hey!
So,
Awesome.
It's also the original kind of rum release we did for Australia was the one time I think I've seen Westward on the resale market, and it was kind of a surreal moment.
on the resale market.
Yeah.
Nice.
I think it was somewhere around $1,000 for a bottle of the rum cask
It
in
was selling
cask
for crazy
strength.
high prices on the secondary market. Yeah.
And that was the Australia release, which Australia is a very big market, very good market for Westward.
You've got another fan of rum casks here in the comments.
Yay,
Thanks for joining
thank
us,
you.
Spirits.
And so I'm happy we got to introduce it to our main market, and of course to our club. And that's finished with Casa Magdalena barrels, which is a barrel that is a rum that we used to make in collaboration with the largest sugarcane factory out of Guatemala, which is where our CEO is from.
All right, so I've had a minute with this. Obviously, I know this whiskey really well. I'm actually going to throw it to Phil now. So since you've just recently started experiencing Westward, what do you think? Like, how would you describe the flavor of your stout cask?
So it is, I've had a handful of stout finished beers or stout finished whiskeys and whiskey distilled from beers. And this is about as beery as some of the whiskeys distilled from beers, which is an interesting artifact, I think, of the slightly more floral nature of your base malt with the added sort of floral citrus note of the hops and that sort of dark cocoa and coffee notes from the stout.
Nice. I'm actually going to throw it back to Anna and Jonathan now and ask how, without me sort of throwing tasting notes at you, how would you typically describe some of your core lineup? If that's like a fair question to ask, if like me asking you to do tasting notes, right?
I'll have Anna kind of go through her main notes.
I would say the heart of Westward is this, everything starts out as the original before it's transferred to a finishing cask, right? So it's good to start there. And it has this really lovely balance between the fruity notes, which to me are very melon and kind of a hint of papaya, and the oak, which we pick not to be too strong. When I'm blending it, I'm going for an oak profile that reminds me of autumn leaves, and it has that sweetness that's really attractive, but not too much, right? And we always incorporate into the blend some barrels with herbaceous notes, and that can come from certain barrels where they'll lend almost like a bay leaf or a mint quality, and that gives it length and it gives it vibrance to the original. So it's something that you may pick out when you're tasting it. And I find the finish to be sort of a mixture between that light fruitiness and like dry grass. How does that sound to you? Does that resonate with you?
I loved that. I almost feel like I've reviewed very few of the bottles of Westward that I have, actually. It's one of those things where I'm like self-conscious about it. Part of it is because I spent 3 months relearning how to taste whiskey on the Pinot cask. So it's one of those things where like Wild Turkey tastes like bourbon to me because that's the bourbon that I used to drink for years and years and years. Westward tastes like American single malt to me, right? It's sort of the basis for all things, and it's been so difficult for me to get additional tasting notes out of it. That set of tasting notes you just said, almost every single one of them is not a tasting note I tend to use, but I got 90% of that as you were saying them, and I was like, oh, that explains so much about the profile here, right? That makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
Take them. They're yours now. Keep them. There's also just malt itself. This whiskey is distilled to bring the flavor of the malt and keep as much of that flavor as possible. So you'll just find like the heart of the barley is there.
Yep.
Yeah. So,
okay, so if we could get back to the...
do we want to
go ahead.
Go through each of the core variations? We have stout cask. And I love that Philip brought up the sort of herbal notes that come through from the hops in the stout cask. That's something that I'm particularly sensitive to. And we get like this wonderful citrus that just marries perfectly with the existing sort of light citrusy flavor of Westward from the hops notes in the stout barrels. And there's also this really rich pastry, sort of chocolatey pastry. And Westward has an existing, Jonathan referred to like the richness of whiskey distilled in a low reflux still. You can get notes of pastry from that, like a rich pastry or like a little like light sunflower oil. Not an oil that's gross, but an oil that makes it richer, right? That's what we mean by the oiliness. And
I tend to use the term velvety. I know whiskey nerds will say viscous, and to newbies that can be scary, so I say velvety.
There you go. The velvety feeling on the palate. And then the stout just builds that out beautifully into like a chocolate pastry because it's lending those beautiful chocolate and coffee notes to the whiskey.
Yeah.
And
so that note of
sessions, we're usually balancing that with that herbaceous citrusiness, so it falls right in the middle. It's not too much one or the other.
Yeah. So that note about velvety versus viscous, I think for me that comes down a bit in the realm of like thinking of flavor in terms of other types of constructions, right? Like sometimes, I mean, there's an actual physical structure to tasting whiskey, right? That's part of the experience of the palate, where viscosity is part of it and the amount that it burns is part of it. And, whether it's mouth coating and that sort of thing. And like, you can describe those elements as tasting, as part of a review, as not quite tasting notes, but you know what I mean? But then there's another sort of thing where I'll tend to describe certain flavor profiles as with physical descriptions, right? Like the flavor of such and such texture, right? Like the flavor of Westward, for example, to me is velvety. So the fact that you use the term velvety as a mouthfeel description, whereas I almost use that as a flavor description.
As a flavor description. Yeah.
Okay.
And I like that.
Let me ask you this.
Go ahead.
Does the flavor of an apple, when you picture the flavor of like green apple, does that have a texture for you?
A little bit like sandpaper, and I know that like that partly is like there's a texture of the apple, but like there's also like the sort of way that the acidity of the apple and the sweetness interact is a little bit rough to me, if that makes sense.
What about if somebody
depends on the kind of apple?
A little drop of like lavender water on your tongue. Is there a texture for the lavender flavor in the absence of the texture of the plant?
I know where this is going, and I'm very happy with it.
This is going to sound weird, but I think of that almost as a sine wave or something like that. Like the texture. Now we're really mixing senses. That texture is more of a sound.
This is my jam.
Okay, yes.
You're getting into like my jam because I have synesthesia.
Yeah.
So I have blended senses. My senses are always interacting with each other. I love this stuff. So please tell me more.
Anna is a sensory expert, and Anna will sometimes undersell herself as far as that goes.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I know. I talked to Anna about this, that like after we do this sort of Westward technical interview, there's an entire interview of probably 2 hours worth of just talking to Anna about her synesthesia, which is a fascinating topic that I'll never get tired of hearing about it. We at ACSA, we spent, I think, an entire hour ignoring a party and talking about synesthesia in the corner.
We did. And it was a really good time. We should do that. I love it, Doug. And what I'll say to that is that a little sensory integration is way more common than anyone realizes.
Yeah.
We don't taste anything in isolation, right? We're constantly narrating our senses. We're constantly having these impressions of color and texture and flavor all together. And we can break them down in a rubric if we're like, doing a W set analysis, or if we're trying to like be really analytical about what we're tasting. But the human mind never separates things. And I love how your descriptions are playing on different senses, because that's so natural. And it's such a beautiful thing to appreciate about how we taste whiskey.
I completely agree. I like, there's a lot of people in, I'm going to generalize this the wrong way, but a lot of the people that I've met in the distilling industry, in the spirits industry, whether it's craft spirits or American single malt, or just, I have less experience speaking with people from like larger distilleries. So we'll just say craft spirits or American single malt. So many people involved in the spirits industry are musicians of some description or music lovers. And so many of those people will sometimes self-consciously and sometimes very deliberately describe constructing a whiskey or tasting a whiskey as music.
I was actually just about to talk about this, which is that I use a lot of musical terms when I talk about tasting as well. Bass and treble tend to be some of my favorite terms to use when tasting things, because like things can have good taste but be all treble, and so it doesn't have that bass that you need to actually have full harmony. That being said, though, the whole reason why I've worked in so many parts of the beverage industry in general is I've noticed there is a base science that can ground art, and then on top of that, it's all art and expression. And it also leads to this really cool odd coupling of all the artists and the scientists both working together and also being the dual sides of people. Miles, our master blender, is like, extensively trained in the sciences of this, of this industry. And I know for a fact that he would still describe himself as a musician first before a scientist.
That's beautiful.
It's a cool through line.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I could name drop a lot of people who have talked to me about whiskey as music, but that's sort of probably outside the scope of the conversation.
Yeah.
Obviously, we have as our guests today people who are experts in the flavor of Westward whiskey, and probably wouldn't be too far to say that you're also experts in the flavor of American single malt or whiskey in general, right? So this is a question that it came up on the tour, as part of the tour. That was a musical glass, yeah. Who was that? Was that Phil?
It was me. I
Okay.
actually pierced myself with my empty glass and my full glass.
Sometimes we ignore the little bits, and then sometimes people call it out, and we're like, let's lean into it a little bit.
Usually I'm the one making a ruckus by accident.
I talk with my body. You'll see me moving around a lot.
Yeah, my camera is so high up that a lot of my hand gestures like don't show up. Like I'm gesturing here, you can see my arms moving, but they're actually my hands are out of view of the camera. So I could do the Ron Burgundy thing, or no, the Talladega Nights thing. What do I do with my hands?
Ricky Bobby.
Right, and just like Ricky Bobby. Okay, so there's a question that always comes up for me when I take your tour, which is, as we reach the end of the tour through the distillery, you offer a taste of the White Dog, which is the new make that you've proofed down to, I think it's 90 proof, which is the typical bottling strength of your core releases. And then everybody on the tour tastes that. My sensory experience of that White Dog is almost entirely unlike what I get from the end product that you bottle as your core range, which has that velvety flavor texture to it and all this complexity. It's a pretty estery whiskey, both in the new make form and in the bottled form. But it's there's somehow I'm missing a through line of like how we got from the flavor of the new make to the flavor of what came out of the barrel. In particular, there tends to be, for some of the releases, I guess, there tends to be stuff that feels like maybe a little bit hoppy or dank, even, especially
Yeah,
the
there's
cask
definitely
strength.
there
And
can be skunkiness to Westward in a really positive way.
Yeah, but like, where does that come from when you look at the new make and you use number 3 char new oak barrels?
Yeah.
What's
Before
the through
Anna
line? Where are those
And then-
flavors coming from?
Before Anna answers anything in a very scientific manner, I'm going to answer it in a very Jonathan manner, which is
Okay.
it's Doug, it's magic. So much of this is controlled chaos, and it's a very predictive industry. We know some changes in which we're doing affects a flavor in different ways by the way in which we test things. But I remember I had a really good moment about talking to CK Christian, our founder, who is one of the most scientific people about flavor analysis as well that I know. And I was talking to him about our stout cask, and I don't remember which part of it was. I was like, why does it do this? And he just said magic. And I was like, what? Like, the most scientific man just said magic to me. And he was just like, this industry is chaos in a lot of ways, and sometimes you just you accept it where you can. The White Dog, the reason why we don't sell it is because it is a wonderful glimpse into the stepping stone that becomes Westward. And I mean, you described this disparity, but there is one through line in that, like you mentioned that herbal tone. To me, the fruit on the White Dog is a little more raisiny than the white peachiness that I get from something like our main release. But it's something that, esters are something that are very ethereal, to me at least, that can be very interesting in the way that their lifespan changes. Now I'll pass it off to someone who knows what they're talking about.
Are you ready for some science?
Yeah, just let me address a couple of comments before, because there's comments going by, and I feel like I should address some of them before we get too far along.
Yeah, please.
So Huggy Bear said that he absolutely loved his cask strength pick that he bought from Binny's. Apricot stone fruits for days, absolutely beautiful product, and that dovetails a bit with the flavor notes that you were just talking about.
I recently had that Benny's pick. It's a good one.
Nice. I haven't had it. Maybe I need to go find it now. I love the stone fruit stuff. I usually get from something like Balcones. There's a lot of stone fruit in Texas whiskeys, especially. And Huggy Bear also acknowledged there's so much complexity from just the single grain, the single malts. So I figured I should read that out, because those are comments from Instagram. I can't show them on screen. And the other thing that I wanted to call out is I just heard that Freedom Malts wrapped up a stream, and Rough Spirits and Freedom Malts joined us here. So they say hi. And Freedom Malts has a question. How long have you been working with Westland? Which I think we covered earlier on. But
Westward.
Westward.
Sorry. Yeah,
Yeah.
Westward. He wrote Westland, so I was just reading it, but you're totally right. And now my wires are crossed, and I'm going to screw that up for the rest of the stream.
Just read my shirt.
Yeah. And
How long have you been working with Westland?
Yeah.
Seriously, it's no problem. We are, close in proximity and names, and we both make American single malt, even though we both have fundamental different approaches. But more the merrier in our.
Yeah, it happens. all the time.
Autocorrect. There's got to be someone we can complain to
autocorrect.
about that.
Bias.
I have been working for Westward around 4 years now, but in the industry for around 10.
I've been working for Westward for 2.5 years. I came on in June of 2021. I graduated from wine school in 2014.
We should talk more about wine school later. But for the
Yes.
moment, where can we go from talking about the new make? Oh, science. Yeah. So what's the science?
Yes.
So what's the through
So
line?
you-
Like, how do you go from new make that's fresh off the still to what you're drinking in the bottle? And there's a lot more to it than just the whiskey sitting and absorbing some things from the oak and concentrating, right? When we start with brewing our wash with the brewer's yeast for a reason. We want to take the base ingredients that will create the flavors you have later, right? Everything that you taste in here starts with the building blocks that we develop in fermentation. And brewer's yeast produces esters, right? Those esters smell fruity. If you stick your nose in the fresh wash, you might get a hint of apple. And when we capture that, when we distill that, it doesn't stay apple, because what those esters do is over time, an ester is, when you have an organic acid and it reacts with an alcohol and they link up and form an ester, it can fall apart and react with something else and form a new ester. And then that can fall apart and react with something else and form a new ester. And esters you never had before will constantly be forming and reforming during maturation. If you have the right building blocks, this process is constantly evolving. And there's dozens of esters out there, all with different flavors ranging from pineapple to candle wax. And if you taste the same barrel a few months apart, twice, right, it may taste of candle wax, and then a few months later taste of pineapple or coconut, because this ester profile constantly evolves. It's like rolling a ball down a hill, right? You want to aim at the right direction from the start, and then you let gravity do the rest of the work. That's happening during maturation in Westward, just constantly changes. Additionally, you noted some like skunky aromas that come off in the new make. We have copper in our distillation system, and the copper is there to react with volatile sulfur compounds that can smell skunky, or they can smell like cabbage or like onion or all sorts of other things that you wouldn't necessarily want your whiskey to taste like. The copper is there to react with those things and remove them. On the other hand, we have a low reflux system, which means the still is short, and the contact with copper is lower than you get in those tall stills in Scotland, right? So a little of that can come over into the high wines, and you may pick it up when you taste them. But when those high wines go into the barrel, the char on the surface of the barrel acts like this, almost like a carbon filter. And I don't want that to be taken the wrong way, because it's not stripping out all the flavor, but it loves binding to those sulfur compounds. So that skunkiness, or maybe that like hint of like something in between a grapefruit and an onion, it will bind to the char inside the barrel, and it will deplete over time. Additionally, we all know that oak lends flavor to the whiskey. Our oak barrels are made with staves that are seasoned outside. Naturally, they're allowed to season. And that seasoning process brings out flavors in the oak that are important to the whiskey that we make, right? And you end up with beautiful spectrum of flavors from the barrels, from vanilla to baking spice to chocolate, to even herbaceous and resiny aromas, right? Those are all there in the vast collection of barrels that we have in the warehouse. And then when the blending team sits down to compose a blend, and we compose our blends, we pick each barrel that goes into the tank that's being prepped for bottling by hand. So every time we bottle, we have exactly the whiskey we want. We are selecting those barrel characteristics so we can have all of them, all the right ones present in the perfect balance. And that brings us to what we have here.
And thus is the art of blending. But before we get into that, because hopefully I feel this is a shorter branch of the conversation, but I could be wrong. So you mentioned the chaotic nature of aging whiskey. I have many thoughts, but I'll try to keep this focused. So obviously there's a chaos to the to those chemical reactions that you were just explaining, and a certain amount of maturation, a certain amount of age is going to cause those reactions to happen to a certain, I guess, conclusion point. Trying to recall some of my chemistry from high school, ester reactions tend to reach an equilibrium. So there's usually, at a given temperature, there's going to be some concentration of esters, some concentration of water. If water evaporates, then the equilibrium will get pushed. There's other sorts of mechanisms like that. So you mentioned a chaos. But obviously you have a pretty consistent product that comes out the other side, and sort of blending comes in. But before we get into blending, do you find that chaos produces individual single casks that are worth highlighting?
Oh yeah.
Is that how you get your club release bottles that are mostly, they're listed as single casks, but I don't know what your
that's recently changed. It was just we had it listed as single barrel selection. That's a little misleading, not purposefully, so we did change it. Our club releases are about 30 barrel projects at this point. But no, single casks are becoming a very big thing for Westward. We are getting some really interesting things. And to answer a little bit of the chaos point is, art is a lot of chaos, but whiskey in general, as far as beverage goes, has some really fun chaotic nature to it, and that lies back into the theme that I talked about of adaptation. There's a reason why, since the beginning, whiskey is not environment controlled. That whiskey definitely has a sense of place, and that's why we do what we do. And if we were just going for consistency and predictability, maybe places would just control their barrel houses, control the climate in which they're aging. But that's where a lot of that beauty stands. And so where we are getting that consistency is almost entirely Anna, where we're putting trust in the beginning of our process. We're being extremely hands-on. And we are then trying to strike that consistency in the end of our process, which is on our blending team with our barrel batches. Once they're in barrel, we're not trying to rotate and manipulate any barrels. It's really just about putting trust in ourselves at what we did at that point.
So embrace the chaos.
Yeah.
It's that's what art is in so many ways. It's how do you channel that chaos?
We work within guardrails, but we accept a certain amount of variation from batch to batch in how the high wines taste, because we know that those will be our blending tools later.
Yeah,
those will be different colors in our palette.
So individual barrels are going to have some personality to them. Right.
Yeah.
With the chaos produces personality, which is great. I really like a brand that actually has a lot of different expressions that target different flavor profiles, as you do. You've got 4 core expressions and a 5th if you count the rum cask. Hopefully I counted that correctly. Yeah, I think so.
No, you know that.
And then every quarter you've got a few thousand barrels, I think, runs of the bottles, not barrels.
A few thousand. 30 barrels. Roughly of a new experiment.
Yeah. So there's always an opportunity to try something new when it comes to Westward, which is great.
I feel like that's also very tied to being innovative on the American whiskey side of things. If we are looking at American single malt, we are already looking at a very large re-education process. In my mind, there's a reason why Westward is very popular outside of the States. Because in the States, there is a re-education process that needs to happen when it comes to whiskey. Because, people, when we think very binary here, people think something is a Scotch, and if it's not a Scotch, it's a bourbon. That's a very American way of thinking of things. Whereas I've noticed the rest of the world has a lot of regional single malts wherever you go. So mainly they're worried about what it tastes like. And if it tastes good, sweet. The reason I bring that up though, is it means that we automatically attract this audience who is curious, who wants to actually get really good knowledge about the process, understand the process, and also try something a little different, which is why I think we've had such good reception and good things coming out of the club, and saw that rapidly grow since 2019, because I think we're at above 3,000 members at this point. Of people who are getting these quarterly shipments. And because we are paying attention on the front end of the process, that means, there are plenty of places that have a diverse array of releases that happen through their finishing processes. And so does Westward. Finishing processes is awesome. You can get a lot of nuance by collaborating with other liquids in this industry. And other barrels, but paying attention to the yeast, my nerdiness always comes out when it comes to the projects in which we're distilling a specific beer, we're using a different yeast strain, or mixing up our fermentation, because that usually tends to be a gap that we don't see in the market as much.
Germ says, I've always found whiskey fascinating in the fact that there's a large amount of science and a large amount of art involved. Art and science rarely coincide so well. Very well put.
Yes.
This is why I do this. I'm also a visual artist. And I'm not the only one. A lot of us are artists or musicians in production.
The way that I've always the way I've explained it to people is when you ask anyone who works at Westward or in this industry, it's like they either have a liberal arts degree or a hard science degree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We all love both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a film degree.
There you go.
With
Is anyone
marketing,
else
so I guess it
hearing-
applies, but
Is anyone else hearing beeps? I'm hearing like what sounds like a little chirping something. Is that just on my end?
No.
I think it may just be you.
yeah.
Okay.
If
Well,
I
if
may-
nobody's hearing it, that's fine. I think I know what it is, and I'm not going to worry about it.
If I may, for a moment, sort of crib something that another distiller said. They jokingly said that distilling is sort of like the alchemic process of making gold, but more successful, because there's
Yeah.
science and art and magic.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with that more.
It's so funny hearing Anna explain the processes behind esters, and in my mind I'm still like magic.
Sometimes I can be the anti-magic.
No, you described
But I
magic.
think that science has that magical quality to me. Knowing everything about it doesn't take away the awe. It gives me more.
Not when it comes to whiskey.
Yeah.
Nice. So I guess this leads me to a question. I mean, I have obviously so many questions about what Westward does, but this leads me to a question before we get into the blending of the core releases. 30 barrels, right? Even your club releases are, you're not tied to what a single barrel is doing, right? You've got 30 barrels maybe to work with to produce that release. I would imagine that means that you're choosing and rejecting some barrels for each of those releases. And my question is, what happens to the barrels that don't make it? Because your core releases are pretty tied to a certain set of barrel types.
Yeah.
So say what happens to the Sauterne?
Oh, sorry.
So what happens to the Sauterne casks, for example, that you didn't end up using in that release?
So are you talking about special releases, or are you talking about any release?
I'm talking about how the special release barrel composition plays into or doesn't play into your core releases.
Well,
Sorry if that's a confusing question.
The special releases tend to be set aside early.
Okay.
Yeah. And if a barrel isn't used in a special release, that's not a question I can fully answer, because it's up to Miles and Otis at the warehouse to decide, probably to set that barrel aside for a different special release in the future. When we're blending our core whiskeys, we usually start with maybe 40 barrel samples on the table, and we might be selecting 24 of them for a blend. And the ones that we don't select, we just keep for the next round. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but something that doesn't make it into a special release could be part of a different special release in the future, if it's
Yes.
a special release that incorporates different things.
That's what I was going to say
Yeah.
as well. Is I talked to Miles about our sourdough release, which is particularly a fascinating release in that we used a sourdough mother as our yeast strain on our brewing side. There were plenty of barrels that we have of it that were not incorporated into our most recent release. And the purpose of that is we are still sitting on barrels. A lot of this is we line up the releases according to when we are starting to see them come to fruition, and sometimes things change. So there, some of those barrels will be incorporated into our single barrel projects as well, selling single barrels to different accounts. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's finding single barrels is fun, because it's kind of like finding a little chunk of gold in the river or something. It's like, have you ever looked for agates at the coast? It's like that feeling.
I want to say something that may be very controversial. It shouldn't be controversial. The thing that makes single barrels so special is not the fact that they can never be replicated. It is the flavor profile that they've struck.
Yeah.
There are places that that found themselves entirely on the idea of releasing every barrel as a single barrel. And to my mind, that doesn't make any sense, because a single barrel that we pick out to be chosen as a single barrel is done so because it's special. So I don't want to disparage places that entirely found themselves on the idea of just being single barrels, but you not only do you lose on consistency, but a lot of the time you are losing a good rounded, balanced flavor profile.
Yeah. I'm a big believer in the idea that you achieve the best balance through selecting barrels and putting them together. And if you're so small that you're releasing barrel by barrel, you can release an excellent product, and you may have a really devoted fan base that loves the variation in your project, loves seeing it as a seasonal thing, the way you would approach vintages of wine. But the best balance is one that you compose by putting the different puzzle pieces together. And what's so special about single barrels is that once in a while, you'll find a barrel that is perfectly balanced all by itself. Oh, and it has that unique quality that really stands out and makes it different. And those don't just come along every day, right? There's just a few of them here and there that we hunt down and set aside and say, that's really awesome. We're not putting that in the next mingle. It needs to be set aside because it's so good by itself.
So Westward is one of those brands that talks a lot about blending, like as part of the brand story. Not everybody does that. I'm not entirely sure why. Blending is a really important part of the process, especially when you're talking about making a consistent product from month to month to month, even year to year to year. And especially when you're talking, I mean, you're essentially still at a craft scale, maybe arguably, right, borderline a little bit. We didn't really get into it, but that's sort of the numbers that come out during the tour element of any given distillery, right? Everybody likes to talk about like how many pounds of grain, how much goes in the fermenters, how much comes off the stills, and so on. But in isolation, it's really hard, I think, for any given consumer to really know, how does this fit into the broader whiskey industry, right? How does this compare to the big Scotch distilleries that I know? How does this compare to the big bourbon distilleries that I know? How does this compare to the tiny distillery that's in my hometown? Right? If you could contextualize your numbers a little bit in terms of how big you are.
It's large. That's ethereal for me as well, to be honest. Because I have, most of these numbers, obviously they are a moving target as we grow. But I would describe something as a micro distillery, a medium-sized distillery, and then of course a large distillery. But to me, the difference between a medium-sized distillery and a large distillery is so drastic. I think we have, we obviously need to be bigger in the way that our production is set up. But there are distilleries out there that are spilling more whiskey in a day than we make. Yeah, I mean, do
you want some numbers for what our production currently stands at? Because
sure.
I just don't
I wonder.
Don't retain.
I wonder what number
outputs. I wouldn't be able to compare us to other distilleries.
Okay, fair enough. I sort of wonder what number resonates with the consumer in terms of like, what's the best? Is it like number of bottles per year? Is it number of barrels per day?
We're per day. About 6 barrels per working day.
Yeah, 6 barrels per day tends to be an easy one for us to cling on to.
Yeah.
Okay.
6 barrels.
Which is, if you want to break that down, if we're bringing that down to bottle strength, it's just shy of 300 bottles per barrel. So, you're then looking at like what, 1,800?
Yeah.
1,800 bottles a day.
1,800 bottles.
Which needs to be higher.
Yeah. We are.
Yeah. So like you mentioned that you have a foreign demand for your products.
Yeah.
I don't remember who I've heard talk about it most recently, but Westward in general likes to talk about the fact that their biggest export market is Taiwan.
Taiwan is massive. Yes. So I think Taiwan has now passed Australia as far as.
Oh, it has?
I think so.
Wow.
I was talking to Margot about it. I'm not going to commit to that, especially since I'm on record. But it is. Margot framed it as, if it is not crushing it yet, it is going to very soon.
No kidding.
Taiwan is a very big market for us. Singapore is good for us. But also, it's another place. Taiwan is another place that is having its boom. And so when places are in their educational boom, they're seeking out things that not only taste good, but are also on that forefront of education, of that nerdy side of things. So we do have a tremendous amount of single barrel projects going out that direction.
Lots of single barrels too. Okay.
Yeah, mostly single barrels.
Okay.
But they buy a lot of single barrels.
Okay.
I guess something.
There's a tag-on question, I guess, you pretty much answered it, but like, why Asia in particular, as far as your export markets go? Why not Europe? I don't often hear mention of Westward going to Europe, for example.
I don't have very solid questions. One of them is I don't always want to frame our stuff doing well in other markets only around their environment. I want to also say that our salesperson who is in charge of Australia is also in charge of Taiwan, and they're the best salesperson I've ever interacted with in my life. So I want to give a due amount of credit to that fact. But I do have theories on why, that fact. I think it is coming down to innovation at the time. Taiwan and Australia are both experiencing distilling booms. They're both experiencing, a new market that is ready to climb. Whereas, Europe has a lot of tradition baked into it. But that's also not saying it's applicable to all. So we haven't made our Japanese debut, and that could be entirely different from the way that we're handling our Taiwanese debut. And it could not work. So we're playing it by ear, and obviously we are in a lot of European markets. I know there is a particular great bottle shop in Ireland that has us. I got to pay them a visit. It was fun. But we have yet to make the same amount of mark as something like Taiwan and Australia.
Okay. I have a couple of questions from Instagram. Are there club members in Taiwan and Australia?
Okay. I have an answer to this. Do you want me to just keep talking?
Yeah.
I feel like I'm talking too much.
I don't know the answer to that. So
our club for a while, up until I think 2021, if I'm late 2020, maybe even 2022, it was Oregon exclusive. And then we opened it up to be national club to about 32 states, depending on alcohol laws and how they stand at the time, because it changes, all the time. So technically, to be a club member, you have to be in America. That being said, we have partnerships with whiskey clubs that we do club releases for. So a partnership with Whiskey Club Australia, which is, I'm sure I even had incorrect numbers at this point, but like a 36,000 member whiskey club, where we will do a release with them. But also I spent my honeymoon semi-recently over in Scotland, and I was in Inverness, and there's a fantastic little whiskey bar over there called the Malt Room. And I walk in, and I was wearing my work vest, which doesn't say whiskey on it. I realized it has the Westward W, but doesn't say whiskey anywhere on it. And I walked in, and the guy who was running the bar was like, "You," and I found out he was getting all of our club releases shipped to him in Scotland, probably illegally. And so we do have people who are club members who are around the globe, just maybe less legitimate.
Secret club members.
Yeah, secret club.
Secret club members.
I love it.
I'm going to interject here really quick. It is 7:20. I'd like to just ask our audience. We've got a handful of people on YouTube and on Instagram. If you have any questions that you would like us to ask, now is the time to throw them into the ring, and we'll circle back around and try to answer as many of them as we can.
Yep, absolutely. I have another question from Celebrate Whiskey on Instagram. What's the oldest whiskey in the Westward Rickhouse, which I also would like to know the answer to.
It's been a minute since I asked that question.
At least 10 years old, but it doesn't
Yeah.
matter.
Okay. I was
Okay, well, okay, you talked.
But yeah, Westward peaks.
Yeah.
Well before 10 years.
Yes.
Older is not necessarily better for our whiskey because Westward reaches its optimum when the spirit is in balance with the oak. And if you leave it in barrel for too long, it becomes over oaked.
And you talked about why we are a distillery that wants to be on the forefront of talking about blending. I do actually have some answers on why a lot of people aren't approaching that, and that is, the legal definition of blending versus the historical definition of blending. It can get a little dicey as far as what that means. It doesn't mean we're adding anything from other distilleries. It doesn't mean we're adding unaged product. It doesn't mean we're adding any color. What it means is we are taking barrels that we have tasted that are done aging to then, marry. That, I think, because those two get confused a lot of the time, is why a lot of people don't talk about that process. But it's also key to why, we're not talking about age statements. We're not talking about why older is always better. There was a great distiller, a distiller in Scotland that I talked to, and I won't out him or his brand, but he was saying, he was like, why I don't, release this whiskey as at 12 years when, let's say they have like a 12-year release and an 18-year release, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, why I didn't release that whiskey at 12 years? It's because it tasted like shit at 12 years. And so, like, it doesn't always mean that the whiskey is going to be better due to how old it is. Obviously, that became a natural part of the process because some places have different weather and use used barrels. So
I think it goes back to what you said earlier.
Yeah.
Whiskey adapts to the place where it is made. And whiskey made in Scotland takes more time to reach its prime, right? Whiskey made here is being matured in a rickhouse in the Oregon weather, which is known for being cold and rainy in the winter, but actually gets quite hot in the summer and accelerates the process of maturation.
Yeah.
And so our whiskey has its perfect time, and past its perfect time, it's not better.
Plus, you were talking about that chaos of the ester development. I might even throw out this analogy that there may even be an art, maybe sort of like fishing even, of catching the barrel right when the ester development has hit its ideal point, where you get the balance of the flavors that you necessarily want, or even a particular balance of flavors that's good for something like a single barrel profile that is maybe unexpected but particularly good. And that's not necessarily going to be making the barrel older. It's going to be you happen to get it right at the right moment. Does that ring true in any way?
That can be part of it. Yeah, capturing it at the right moment.
I also realized we've talked a lot about this, but we never talked about where Westward is usually landing on the age spectrum average-wise, which we're usually sitting at about 4.5 to 6 years average.
4.5 to 6 years. Okay. So this single barrel that I have from Single Cask Nation, that's a 6-year-old, is a little on the older side of your profile then, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, even that, it does extend out. We've done a release, the wheat wine release, which was a 9-year-old whiskey. It's not that we want it to be younger. It's that sometimes it's ready when it's younger. Sometimes it's ready when it's older.
Right.
Yeah,
So,
I sold a single barrel recently, and I sold the youngest barrel that was in the lineup for what was available, and it was still 5 years old. So at that point,
So aside from sometimes marketing materials on the single barrels, so for example, I have this Westward's own branded single barrel selection from the Our Bourbon program, the Cabernet finished, which funny enough is labeled as if it's a Pinot Noir cask. I don't know if you can see that. Apparently that was just a little bit of a mix up on the bottling line, but the copper label on the bottom has the correct Cabernet finished. So anyway, this is a fantastic bottle, and somewhere in the marketing materials, I believe it said what the age is, but it's not written on the bottle. So that might have been somewhat just like privileged information. It's part of selling out a barrel, that sort of thing, because people go for age statements, right?
I mean, when it's a single barrel, it becomes much more appropriate information, but it does get a little grating on a personal level when it comes to when you're working for a luxury whiskey that is putting a lot of time into its whole process. And the first question that people ask me as an educator is, "Oh, how old is it?" Equating age to quality, because that's wholly
right.
You
The
can have
fallacy of
35
age
years,
equals
or it can just
quality.
taste like sawdust.
Yeah.
Right. So I love to tell people older is not necessarily better. And anybody who's a fan of heavily peated whiskey will probably acknowledge at least that the certain phenolic qualities you're looking for in a heavily peated whiskey tend to go down with time. In fact, one of my favorite heavily peated whiskeys from Scotland is only 5 years old, which was when I realized how young it was coming from back when I used to mostly drink Scotch. It's like, wow, how did they achieve this flavor with 5 years old? And then I started to realize that correlation of the older ones tend to be less peaty. There's the Octomore 10-year-old releases are less phenolic than the 5-year-old-ish Octomores from the standard releases, for example. So if anybody needed a really clear example of why older is not necessarily better, heavily peated Islay Scotch is almost as a class defines that the exception to the rule, I guess. I know that Phil generally agrees with me. I think that older is not necessarily better. Definitely rings true in our community.
I mean, yeah, and definitely as it applies to American whiskey. For example, I have a 13-year-old rye in my hand that is blown out of the water by a lot of rye whiskeys that are 4 years and younger. I have a bare knuckle produced by KO Distilling in Manassas, Virginia. It's under 3 years old. It is 32 months old, if I'm reading the label correctly from here. It's a long way off, and I'm blind. Way better, in my personal opinion, than this. Way more nuanced, more of the rye flavor than just licorice and oak chips.
I also don't want to be perceived wrong in that, like, I do understand why a lot of people err on the side of caution on this point, because hold on, I'll answer that question.
Sorry, I was getting that up.
No, you're good. There is where was I going? Sorry, I got sidetracked by thinking about that age statement idea.
I threw you off. I apologize.
I don't know. I got it. I don't want to like put anyone off by that the caginess on that front, because I do understand what has brought people to that idea, and that there are plenty of small distilleries who are releasing things before they are ready. There's plenty of there's plenty of distilleries out there in general who are releasing things. Things can be too young the same way that things can be too old. That's how I always pitch it. So when we are having something that is younger, it is because we have deemed it balanced at that point. So it's not about trying to get things out of barrel faster to make more money. So I do get that thought process on how people got there.
Right. So most of the time, Westward's releases, maybe all the time, aside from independent bottlings, Westward's releases don't declare their age on the label, generally as a rule. Some people might perceive that as the sort of the no age statement problem of like, you're not putting the age statement on there because you think, not necessarily that it's bad whiskey, but that you think probably correctly that putting the age on it, given that it's younger, might be bad from a marketing perspective, which dovetails to Germ's question. Are there any plans to release a larger, perhaps double-digit age-stated whiskey, like a 10-year, for example, because the larger age-statement whiskeys have a positive marketing stand?
While that being said, Westward has always been so concerned about tastes, and because we're on a re-education journey, we aren't always in the place to be doing what is always the most marketable. It is not most marketable to be using a grain that's 18 times more expensive than corn and spending 6 days to ferment. What that does, though, is create really good juice. And at 10 years, things past double digits, Westward just doesn't taste the same.
Good to know. I definitely would be interested in knowing, even if it's not good, what something that is too old, past its maturity, from Westward actually tastes like. And
think
I
I've
have
had
on
it.
my wish list of I'd love to go on a tour through your barrel house at some point. Obviously, that hasn't happened yet. There's good reasons for that. For one thing, you're moving from a previously rented, I think, public storage space, if I understand correctly, essentially a large unit in a public storage type situation, to a building where you're the only tenant, which sounds like it can only be a good thing. And on that note, are you worried about the aging profile changing between the two facilities?
Well, they are different. We'll see what this new facility is like in the summer, because the temperatures are bound to be different during the year. This one really stays cooler during the day, but it's hard to say until we've been there for a full year.
It's also
Yeah.
it is location wise not too far off from our original barrel house.
Yeah. So it's in the same climate.
Yeah.
We are
Right.
still in the
It's,
same climate.
I guess, more the differences in the building, I would imagine.
The building
I mean,
itself.
Oh, totally.
yeah. Even two barrels that are otherwise identical sitting right next to each other in the same building can have wildly different aging profiles. So moving to a new building could be a traumatic, maybe is the wrong word, but certainly a significant change, perhaps.
Well, I also think that aging profile of why those barrels are very different from one another is the uniqueness of a barrel versus not exactly coming from the idea that they're having different aging conditions.
Yeah.
But what is cool about Oregon is because we have that ebb and flow, like, we're getting some of the positive notes. We aren't just pulled through the barrel the whole time. We're pulled in, we push back inside. But we are going up in proof while in barrel.
Okay, yeah, as long as we're talking about proof, I will reiterate probably one of the only drawbacks that I tend to say about Westward whiskey is that by and large, you don't have that many high proof products. And not that I'm a proof hound necessarily, your products largely do shine very well at that 45% alcohol, or the 100 or the 100 proof, like in the rum cask, the 50% alcohol. Like those lower proofs actually do work really well for you. But whenever I have a single barrel like this from you, the cask strength, which I think is probably a batch strength sort of thing, an independent bottler single cask, right? Aside from the fact that there's an individual barrel profile to those releases, they're also a higher proof, and there's something texturally different in the flavor, that flavor texture thing that I'm talking about, that comes through in a barrel strength release. And I really wish that we got to see more of that from Westward. So I was wondering if you could comment on why those releases seem to be so infrequent.
They're becoming more and more frequent.
Yeah.
Obviously, like, we don't want to be tied. This is not a battle, but a bit of a charge forth that Miles wants to do as well, and that he doesn't want Westward to be tied to a particular proof. And the rum cask is a good way of looking at that. We're also doing we did an event for a release that's coming up with Two Towns cider that will be available in the public market that is 100 proof as well. I think some of it comes down to I remember it was right before I was doing a barrel sale thing, and someone was like, do remind them, people who pick barrels, or people who are in the who are so knowledgeable about whiskey that they love cask strengths. Those are the people that like cask strengths. Those are the people that pick cask strength. A lot of the people that want to buy bottles and drink bottles in a more casual market aren't on that same level. Like, not to say that like there is like a correct way of drinking this at all. That just tends to be a trend that I've seen, and that like it could be better for the public to have something that 90 proof as our flagship proof is not incredibly low.
Yeah, and I think actually I would compare this to I really like the music metaphors tonight. And people who listen to a lot of music, and especially musicians who are very nerdy about music, will also often have like some favorite bands that are challenging for other people to listen to.
Yeah.
Mhm.
right? Because when you've heard it all, you want something that will push you.
Yes.
And if you
Uh,
drink spirits all the time,
Oh, I
you
love
start
this.
to crave that heat and intensity and that
Yes.
extra from the cask strength that would really challenge a casual drinker. So
I'm a musician myself. Phil is also. I forgot to tell you guys that in our little introduction earlier. I play viola and violin. You guys might have known that already. I listen to metal music. Oftentimes, I think my original and it's like, so this is not something for everybody, right? I think we could probably agree that metal tends to be challenging music.
yeah,
And I mean, like, it's technical. It's sometimes hard to listen to from like a beauty aesthetic perspective, maybe. But like, mathcore is like right up my alley, you know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's one element. Think of it like a tasting note, or I learned to think of it as an instrument. Some metal music has the screaming vocals, which I find to be a little bit jarring and not necessarily in keeping with the texture of the instruments that I personally want to hear. So I then learned there's a lot of metal that doesn't have that. So metal as a genre, which is many subgenres, shouldn't be written off entirely. There's plenty of really good metal music to listen there, but I would still say metal music, the kind of metal that I listen to, is very much the cask strength of the music world. I also, even in my classical music, I had a roommate once. This was before I realized that I liked metal. This roommate was a big metal fan. I was a big classical music fan. At the time, I was playing Shostakovich, the Shostakovich String Quartet number 8, which you've probably heard. Even if you wouldn't recognize it, go look it up later. Phil's nodding because he knows what I'm talking about. This is the one that has all of the motifs, the da 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 da, right? Now I've officially sang on stream. That's a first time. And singing classical music is usually doesn't come across all that very well. So anyway, the point is, it's jarring, it's difficult, it's challenging. I was playing this music in our apartment, and my roommate is like, that sounds a lot like metal music. I had no idea that classical music could be like that. And I was like, yeah, this is mostly the classical music I listen to. So I convinced him to listen to classical music. And he was like, okay, so if you like that, you should listen to this metal. He convinced me to listen to metal music. And here we are, right? I appropriately expanded my musical horizons thanks
awesome.
to having an open mind. That was a bit of a tangent. I kind of
I
where
feel
we
like
were
it applies to perfectly well. I hope that resonates on. I mean, one thing as well. This is actually a really appropriate tangent in that, or not tangent, a segue rather, in that. On the topic of higher proofing and not being married to single proofing, we are having our very first higher strength club release coming out.
I wanted you to talk about this, so
yes,
go on.
We're very excited about it, and we've been being quiet about it while sipping on it. It is not really like it is not in bottle yet.
This is something else.
It's a test bottle, yeah. Anna did us the great pleasure of pulling something off tank for us as a little preview. Anna, would you like the floor?
Yeah, so I pulled some of our Cuvée Club release out of the tank where we're proofing it down 5 minutes before we came on video for this broadcast. And this club release is an assembly of casks that are different wine finishes put together. So we have some Syrah finishes, and we have some Tempranillo finishes, and we even have a cab finish thrown in there, intentionally blended to create something that captures the best parts of all of those into one release. And it is being bottled at 96 proof. Right now we're tasting it at 98.
96 or 98? We're tasting at 100?
We are tasting it at 98
okay.
Because we're slowly proofing it down, and it's still 2 degrees from the target. And it will be bottled at 96.
Okay, awesome. So, and that's a great segue. I know, and I was sort of angling in a direction before. Let's talk about a recent release that definitely made a big splash. I have a sample here only of the Westward Milestone Edition 1, which actually goes in the other direction.
Yes,
so
it does. It is the lowest proof thing we've ever released.
Right, 86 proof, 43% alcohol. And I don't like harping on prices, but I will say that this is the most expensive thing that you've released. It may be,
Yes.
it's the second most expensive American single malt that I've ever seen, personally. But until 3 weeks ago at ACSA, it would have been the most expensive American single malt that I've ever seen. And as someone who appreciates cask strength and puts value sometimes on paying a little extra for cask strength, the fact that your most expensive bottle, your ultra premium release, is actually the lowest proof thing, I'll be honest, it's a little disappointing in that respect, right? Not even, and this was before I even had a sample of it. That was my opinion of it. So I fully admit that my opinion of that release could have just been colored by the fact that it's low proof and extremely expensive simultaneously. But I wonder if you could comment on, well, first of all, I mean, this is a blender's dream here, the Solera system. So I wonder if you could comment to some length about this, the Westward Milestone release.
I won't be able to comment on the decisions that went into deciding how the milestone was composed and proofed down, because that is entirely the project of Miles Monroe, our master blender. So, I would love to just sit down with him and have a whole conversation about this sometime. And I wish I had more information for you on, what exactly his process. But what I do know from Miles is that the Milestone has this Solera system where he incorporates various barrel finishes to capture the full breadth of the Westward expressions into a single whiskey that just brings all of those components together. We use a very wide variety of finishing casks that have been collected over the years. Some of them are just one-offs, or we only have a few. And the Milestone takes inspiration from all sorts of things in the warehouse to give the full breadth of what Westward can be, right? In a Solera system that will continue to evolve. So what it is now, it will not stay. It's going to evolve and change with time, which is part of the beauty of this approach. And the Milestone gets slow proofed. It gets very, very slowly proofed down. That practice is taken from brandy making. And in the production of cognac has to be slow proofed, because if you proof it down too quickly, saponification occurs. It tastes soapy, and you also lose a lot of your volatiles. And this isn't something that's strictly necessary in the whiskey industry, because saponification is less of a risk, but that slow proofing can still give you a whiskey that is incomparably seamless. So seamless that nothing else even approaches that seamlessness. And I think that's something that's exemplified in the Milestone. So those are the qualities that make the Milestone different, that really set it apart.
And talking to Miles, and this is something that I've seen in why that proof, because there was some pushback on that idea, because it is more marketable, especially for the type of people who would look at a big purchase. Usually are the type of people who are leaning towards something that is higher proof, something that is challenging. It is a challenging whiskey, though. It is slow proofed, and that being a central component of why it's as low. Miles has pitched it as having it more intense meant that he was not getting as much discerning nuance that was happening through noticing everything that's going on in it. In a fear of sounding crass about it, there was someone tasted it and was talking about it, and they said it tastes like everything Westward has ever made in one release that works. And I think that Miles took that as a big compliment, because that he is trying to make something that is, while it is ever changing, is speaking to in his mind the chaos that encompasses all of Westward.
Yeah, if the cuvee is the string quartet, the Milestone is the whole orchestra.
Yeah.
Yep.
Westward.
That makes sense to me.
It's the full orchestra. And some more notes on proofing, actually, as a blender and somebody who can talk more to like the technical and the scientific aspects of proofing. As you add water to whiskey, the flavor profile of the whiskey will change, because some things in this glass are more soluble in ethanol. And the higher the ethanol, the more they're going to be retained. And some things are more soluble in water. The higher the water, the more they'll be retained, right? If you start with something that's high proof and you add water, little by little, you'll notice the flavor changes because as the concentration of the water rises, those aromas that are really soluble in ethanol, that love staying dissolved in ethanol and won't leave into the headspace, won't evaporate, they start to evaporate more, right? And you bring out all these flavors that you wouldn't have otherwise tasted or noticed because they were down below your threshold, because they weren't evaporating, getting up to your nose. And choosing the right proof is a real balancing act where you're bringing out exactly the flavors that you want. And you're also hitting your targets when it comes to texture and length and all the other attributes of whiskey that we love, right? So since Miles is trying to bring out every note of every instrument in the whole symphony orchestra, that proof was intentionally chosen to get the most full expression.
It's I have several comments on that, I guess. So first of all, on the note of the orchestra, there are I'll go to orchestra concerts sometimes, not as much recently, which is actually kind of a shame. But anyway, I'll go to orchestra concerts sometimes, and they'll be playing a new piece that I don't know at all, and I have to approach that almost. So there are some pieces where it just kind of washes over you, right? You just experience it, and that's going to be more in line with what the typical audience goer of an orchestra is experiencing, right? Maybe they've got some percussion motif that's particularly interesting, or there's a sound texture, or there's a particularly featured instrument or something. There's going to be something that grabs you, and everything else is just acting as a support. And then sometimes I'll go to an orchestra concert where I have played or studied the piece of music, and I'm then looking for all of the nuance that I would be looking for in rehearsal. Right, I'll be looking at what are the second violins doing here? What are the violas doing here? That French horn? I didn't notice them sitting on the stage. They've got a cool part. English horn is the one that wouldn't normally be on stage. The French horns are like, they're usually there as a texture, but often you don't find them unless they're playing some kind of a fanfare like you'll get in like movie scores. There's things that stand out, and they're not necessarily the featured bits. But the basses are thumping along, and all of a sudden they'll catch your attention. You'll look at them and you'll go, oh, I like that figure that they're playing. Having studied the piece, though, you sort of know where those things are, and you can sort of look for them. Like you latch on and you go like, oh, I know that the bassoon is going to have a solo in a few bars. I'm going to pay attention to that. Not let it surprise me. I know that the violas have a particularly interesting figure that no one will notice, but since I'm a viola player, I want to pay attention to it and see how the professionals do it, that sort of thing. I feel like it's possible, right, with that context on the milestone, using the portfolio of Westward as a guide to find the tasting notes is probably going to be more successful than just saying, okay, this thing is in my glass, what's going on? And then my initial approach as a reviewer, so with that sort of background in mind, my initial approach to this one as a reviewer is, this whiskey there's a phrase I use, is so well integrated. The flavor profile is so, I don't like smooth, because smooth can mean a whole bunch of different things, but like some people might say that's smooth, right? The nose is the palate is the finish. That's one thing that smooth could mean. It doesn't burn. That's one thing that smooth could mean. It's hard to pull the different flavors apart from each other is another thing that smooth could mean. I'll say well integrated, right? So the flavor profile is well integrated in this one. So well integrated that I can't name tasting notes, and that frustrates me as a reviewer. Right? Because I'm like, how do I write a review of this thing?
Yeah, 100%.
It reminds me of something my sensory analysis teacher told us in wine school when we were talking about naming flavors. Right. And getting good at it. You have to practice a lot to get good at naming flavors. She said that some of the best wines are wines where you can't pick anything out. You taste it and you don't know what to say because there's no part of that wine that sticks out. It's a completely seamless whole that you experience all together at once. And that doesn't make it uninteresting. It just makes it beautiful.
And then sometimes that dovetails with another problem, especially in whiskey, when something is so drinkable like that, that it's not inviting you to pull it apart flavor by flavor. Instead, you just want sip after sip. and suddenly you're done with half the bottle by yourself, and you're like, oh no, I've gotten myself into a state.
I think I don't get that as much with Milestone, at least, just because I feel like the fear is when you have something that is proofed down more, it's going to be, watery, not have the body that you want it to. What I'm guessing through the slow proofing, it is still extremely rich. It is a very rich whiskey.
Yeah, and slow proofing retains more flavor.
Yeah.
So if you proofed it down quickly to that level, you might lose a lot. But the slow proofing, like, you still have so much that it has to offer.
That brings up a question, I guess. Here's a geeky question about the mechanics of slow proofing in the Solera system in general. So I'm imagining. So I have my eye on the time. I know that we're.
Oh, no. I was going to mention, I feel like there was some context to the Solera system that we didn't offer at the outright. It is a 21 barrel Solera system that we are slotting different barrels into that will change year to year, because it will always have different barrels added, but still, an amount of that same initial batch.
Okay. And when you say a 21 barrel Solera system, I'm imagining 21 barrels, but I think that might be wrong. Is it actually a vat of 21 barrels worth of liquid?
No, it's a pyramid of barrels.
Okay. So like a sherry Solera type system.
Like a sherry Solera, where you actually have that many barrels.
Yeah.
Okay. So my question, that's actually really helpful context for my question. So the question is, at what stage in the Solera process do you perform the slow proofing? Is it when it goes into the barrels of the Solera system, or is it when it comes out ready for bottling?
I don't have the answer to that. I'm sorry, I'll have to ask.
Okay.
It is not ready for bottling. I know that. I believe it is during the aging process.
It takes a long time to slow proof, because you're only adding a liter of water at a time over many months.
And the idea is that this is happening while it's aging, if I'm correct. Okay. But there's
a whole process there that I'm not familiar with because I don't do it. And your questions make me want to know more, because that's what happens every time I don't know the answer to a question.
Sure, yeah.
And here's the thing about the Milestone.
I'll add it to my list.
And I know some things about the Milestone, about the barrel makeup, but it's never been a part of the descriptor, and it's something that Miles, he loves about it because it becomes this art piece for him. I know that during this initial first stage has a major feature is the Sauterne cask. I do think I know what he will be featuring as a major component of the second edition, but past that, I'm not really sure.
So when you say is featuring the Sauterne cask, you mean like what went into this Sauterne finished release, yeah?
Yes. Well, barrels, the Sauterne barrels, which are some of the most desirable barrels that Westward has gotten its hands on. They're fantastic.
Okay, so some of the 21 barrels are Sauterne barrels themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Interesting.
At least the first edition.
And it does make sense that the slow proofing might happen. I'd love to know the actual answer to this question, but at least it makes sense to me that the slow proofing would happen while it's aging in the Solera system. So as it's maybe moving from tier to tier, or just a continuous reproofing process as the barrels lose liquid, you'd end up topping them off with the water that you're adding. Obviously, keeping track of its proof as it goes, so you don't take that too far. But I guess the trouble is, so that your proof goes up. You're not at risk of being underproofed by adding water. But definitely the fact that there's math you can do for proofing. But when it's still in a barrel, the proof is still a moving target. So that's a hard thing to do. So obviously you'd be measuring the proof of the barrels periodically as you go through that.
Yeah.
Fascinating. I would love to know more. I feel like there's a whole, we only have 5 minutes left, but there's a whole thing that we could do to talk about the Solera system. So maybe you'll get some more answers. We'll have you back on maybe in time for the next edition of Milestone to come out, and I'll have a fresh sample in hand. Fingers crossed. One can ask at least.
Before we end, is there any questions from the different chats that we can field before we take off?
Otis says I have an invitation to come visit the Barrel House whenever I'm in Portland, so I appreciate that. And besides that,
Awesome.
I think that we handled all of the comments. So if anybody has any final questions for John or Anna, we
Otis,
were
I
good,
hope I
Anna.
get
We,
Wait, is
we,
Otis
we didn't
listening?
spend an
Otis
hour
listening?
talking about synesthesia.
Yeah, before Otis makes the comment, I have your jacket. I'm gonna bring your jacket.
Otis, I hope I answered those questions well, despite not having all of the knowledge that you have about your secret slow proofing process.
Listen, we're very good at being able to know a lot and also admit when we don't know. So
Absolutely. I will always admit
Yep.
when I don't. I don't make things up.
So there was one question I promised to ask Anna when I had her on the show. So I want to make sure that we do that before we end. Anna, what are you geeking out about this week in terms of your data lab?
Oh, what am I geeking out about? Lactic acid bacteria! I'm so excited. I'm finally sending out a plate with the lactic acid bacteria that occur naturally in our grain and grow in our fermentations to have them identified. And I want to know what they are so bad. Because you know that lactic acid bacteria are such an important part of fermentation across all sorts of products, from sourdough to cheese to rum. They're like the secret behind all rum's fruitiness and funk, right? And there's craft distilleries across the United States that love their bacteria, including Leopold Brothers that I just toured in Denver when I was there for ACSA. Love their natural lactic acid fermentation that occurs while they're making their beer. Well, we have our very own lactic acid bacteria that live in our fermentations. And when they peak, when they like really peak in the fermentation, it is so fruity. It's like a fresh pineapple. It's the most delicious aromas that come through in the high wines, and we just love them. And we're going to have them identified so that we know their name and we can find out where else these bacteria occur. We know that they come in on the grain and that they just are naturally part of our terroir, so to speak. You know, our barley grown in the Pacific Northwest is bringing in this microbial ecology that becomes part of Westward, and we want to unveil them. So I'm very excited about that.
Awesome. I'm glad I asked.
It made me feel almost emotional, you saying like you're gonna learn their names for the first time.
Yes,
And that almost made me emotional. Like,
I'm emotional about it.
oh,
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, well,
Listen, I'm
that
very
takes us up pretty much to time, and I have so many more questions that I wish I could ask you guys, but this has been a great conversation, and I think it's best to end on a high note there. So, if I guess here's a real quick sort of rapid fire question just to end. What do you think the theme of this conversation is? What should we cheers on our way out?
Music?
wow, there
Yeah,
is
whiskey,
really-
like whiskey is music is a good theme. Yeah.
Yeah,
What do you think, John?
We've really run the gamut. We've got music, we've got chaos.
We got music and chaos. Mm-hmm.
We've got art and science.
We got challenging yourself.
We've got
The challenging things we love.
we got going against the idea of magic.
Yeah, that's
Yes,
magic.
we got
Yeah.
going against the idea
magic.
of just marketability because we know it makes what we do better. But that's
Yeah.
a long cheers.
Yeah, but we've said it, so I think we should just wrap this up and say that this all boils down to magic.
It's magic.
So, cheers to y'all, to magic. It's
Sandra.
been great having you on. Thank you for your time.
Doug,
And
thank you
until
so
next
much.
time.
Bill,
Loved
it was
it.
a pleasure.
Yeah.
I can actually say this because I know that John is in our whiskey Discord. So yeah, just before we sign off, I haven't done the usual plug. Anybody who's watching who wants to participate with us in a chat room, whether you're on Discord or Discord is a new concept to you, it's basically like public Slack. We talk about whiskey, we talk about movies, music, cars, sports, whatever you think, right? People who love whiskey tend to love other things too. They're a great group of people to hang out with. So if you're looking for a whiskey community to hang out and chat with, you should join the Whiskey Lodge. I'll put an invitation in the show notes. And now my cheers will make sense. So thank you all for joining us today. To magic, and until next time, we'll see you in the lodge.
To magic.
Slancha.
Cheers.
Come by.
Yamas.